Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today on this important subject. Mr. Clarides, as a lawyer, of course, approached the issue of transparency and the rule of law from a very legalistic perspective. I'm a diplomat, so I'm going to approach it more from a political and geopolitical perspective. So for me, the big challenge when it comes to considering issues of transparency and rule of law relate to the battle between different forms of governance, between open societies and closed societies, between democracies and authoritarian systems. And I think if we see the situation over the last few decades, the end of the Cold War and the presumption that liberal democracies would triumph and spread over the world, as articulated in Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis, had been assumed to be the approach that would gain currency. But what we've seen, particularly in the last 10 years or so, the last decade, is a real challenge to that assumption and the rise of more authoritarian states and challenges to the rule of law and the presumption that transparency and open societies should be the preferred solution and the one that will spread over the globe. And I guess my main thesis today, and I'll talk a little bit about the general principle and then talk a bit more about some specific examples, is that despite the challenges to open societies, to the application of the rule of law and transparency, they still remain, those principles, compelling and I think ultimately much more durable and successful than the alternative. So there's a lot of discussion now about the rise of multipolarity, the fact that after the financial crash of 2008, the rise of populism in the West, social media, proliferation of different voices, disinformation, rise of economic inequality, the return of conflict, that the liberal democratic model is in threat and that alternative models are gaining more currency. And I think particularly with the rise of China, this idea that there are now different centers of gravity in global politics. I think particularly we've seen in the last few weeks the expansion of the BRICS to include, pretty not just non-democratic but anti-democratic countries like Iran, cements that perspective that there's a real challenge to the global liberal democratic norms. But I think we've seen already in the last few years that there are weaknesses in that approach. So if you look at China's model, which for a long time people have been questioning, does this invalidate the idea that economic progress and democratization have to go hand in hand, given that their state-planned authoritarian approach to governance did seem to have a degree of economic success. But I think if you look at the situation, particularly during the COVID pandemic and the very harsh zero COVID approach that they took, and the fact that ultimately that was a failure and they had to change and abandon that almost overnight when it became clear that there was no legitimacy for that within the population. There was no sense of inclusiveness in the decision-making or accountability for that, and it was untenable. So even a country like China, which is very controlling, could not impose an absolute model of authoritarianism. And if we look at probably the most dramatic example in recent years, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia for a long time has espoused an alternative model of governance, and its own role as an important major country in the world, a proud country with a strong history, I think was constantly trying to challenge the Western perceptions of what the sense of the appropriate governance structures should be. But if you look at its invasion of Ukraine, it has been an undeniable act of self-harm and defeat. If you look not just in terms of the global response and the sanctions that have been put in place, but particularly in terms of the impact within Russia. So it clearly had a model of economic dependence on hydrocarbons, which was perhaps unbalanced and unsustainable. But even in areas where it had tried to invest in more competitive sectors, in high-skill sectors and research and development, what we've seen over the last few years has been a huge brain drain of hundreds of thousands of well-skilled Russians leaving Russia because they don't want to be in that country anymore with that system of governance and the consequences of it. And in a sense, it's been quite beneficial for a place like Cyprus, where a lot of Russians with those skills have come in. But in addition to that, the nature of this unprovoked aggression from Russia has been a huge weakening of its economic potential. Not just the brain drain, but the mass mobilization and conscription of people who could have been productive members of society, who are now throwing their lives away on a futile war, has had a massive impact upon Russia's economy and will continue to do so. So I think this all makes clear how, despite the narrative that democracy is in decline and that authoritarian or alternative models of governance are more compelling, I think we can see clear examples of how this approach is not working, and how even though there are challenges to the liberal democratic model, the focus on open societies, rule of law and transparency, I think they will ultimately be successful. I want to talk a little bit more now about the situation in my own country, in the UK, not just in terms of how we are working to support visions of open society, but also what we've done domestically, particularly in response to the Russian invasion, because it was a fair challenge to say that although we have been huge champions in the UK of the rule of law, of open societies, some of our models were not as transparent as they could be, particularly when it came to foreign assets and investment in the UK. And we've taken, I think, big steps to try to remedy that, because we do have a commitment to supporting and promoting open societies in the world and in the UK as part of our own value system and part of the approach, the type of world that we want to see. So in relation to Russia, it meant we did a number of things. Firstly, we ratcheted up the economic pressure on Russia to try to force it to end its brutal invasion of Ukraine by implementing sanctions, but also by leaning in to tackle Russia's attempts to circumvent and avoid the sanctions measures in place. So this means that we've been working to come harder down on sanctions evaders, closing all the loopholes that are in place, and working with others to build capacity across partners to do more. So for example, in the UK, our government has committed £50 million to support a new economic deterrence initiative to further strengthen sanctions implementation and enforcement, and to tackle sanctions evasion across the UK's own trade, transport and financial sectors. Because we recognise that in the past maybe we were too lenient, but we are absolutely committed to changing that. And for example, in just August of this year, we had a case where a company was fined £1 million because of its breaching of sanctions and continued trade in unlicensed goods with Russia. In addition, we've set up a new dedicated countering kleptocracy cell in our National Crime Agency to target sanctions evasion and to target corrupt Russian assets hidden in the UK. And this means that despite the fact that there was this perception in the past that Russian oligarchs could hide their money in the UK, that absolutely is not the case anymore. And these measures are not just good news for Ukrainians and all of those who are seeking to cripple Russia's source of funds, but it's good news for the UK as well, because it strengthens our own reputation as an honest broker and as a real country that's committed to the values that we've been promoting. We've also introduced legislation so that we can respond even more swiftly and effectively to sanction oligarchs and businesses. And this in particular, I think this is really important, includes a new register of overseas entities, which helps us unmask the real ownership of foreign companies in the UK, as well as reforms we've put in place to what we call unexplained wealth orders to remove key barriers to their use. So these were the principles we had in place, policies we had in place, but perhaps they weren't as stringent as they needed to be. And so our application of this in an attempt to really enforce the rule of law is a way to support our efforts at transparency. It also means we've made reforms to our Companies House, the way we register companies, to prevent abuse of limited partnerships. Again, situations where companies can avoid declaring their real ownership and their real beneficial owners and use of funds. And we've also introduced additional powers to seize suspect crypto assets more quickly, and also put in reforms to support more effective and targeted information sharing to tackle money laundering and economic crime, new intelligence gathering powers for law enforcement, and we've tried to remove some of the regulatory burdens on business to enable us to be able to target these measures. But we're not only focusing on what we can do in the UK, we're keen to work with our partners to build capacity and promote transparency in the rule of law and counter those seeking to undermine these values. And so in a number of places we're building deeper partnerships, and that includes here in Cyprus as well. Over the past year, we have significantly ramped up our collaboration with the Republic of Cyprus government to support the establishment of a new national sanctions implementation unit. We've shared lessons and expertise from our own Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, OFSI, which was created in 2016 with the aim of ensuring that financial sanctions make the fullest possible contribution to the UK's foreign policy and national security goals, and in doing so helps maintain the integrity and build confidence in our financial services sector. So our Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation's mission statement is to raise awareness of and compliance with financial sanctions, to rapidly detect, respond to and address breaches of financial sanctions, and to provide a professional service to businesses and others affected by financial sanctions. So there's clearly huge read across to the work that we're doing in the UK and the intentions and aspirations here in Cyprus, and therefore we know that there's a lot that can be achieved by our working together to tackle those who are seeking to undermine the sanctions regime and therefore work to ensure that we can be as effective as possible in crippling the Kremlin's war machine. So, huge amount of progress being made here and in the UK, and I think collectively these efforts and the broader efforts to try to ensure that the integrity of the liberal democratic model, the integrity of the commitment to open societies is ensured so that we can make a real impact on this important area of transparency and rule of law. Thank you very much.